Hey everybody, this is Matthew Soltesiak, and you're listening to Not the Same Old Lions podcast, part of the Minute Media Podcast Network. This season, it's all grit. I speak with a variety of guests and interview key players, gaining more insight on what makes this team go. The Detroit Lions are now in a new, grittier era, and we look beyond just the kneecaps when it comes to the analysis. Welcome to another episode. In this episode, we hit on the NFL honors. We give our reaction to the Super Bowl, talk about the Detroit Lions Fan of the Year, and hit on other topics as we start to look forward to 2025. Let's get to it, Lions fans.
This is Mike McMahon, and you are listening to Not the Same Old Lions podcast.
Joining me today is Cameron Clothier, a Detroit-based photographer, videographer, and contributor for Detroit Sports Podcast, Lions on SI. He's a lifelong Lions fan, covered numerous events for the Detroit Lions. Cameron, thanks so much for taking time to talk Detroit Lions today.
Matthew, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for our discussion.
Yes, it's good to touch base again. We met last summer at a Detroit Lions camp. Jamison Williams was there. That was an awesome opportunity there to meet him, see what was going on at that camp. And it's hard to believe it's the middle of winter now. Like the temperatures are complete opposite from what they were that day.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that camp was a lot of fun. I was hired in to take the photos for JMO at that camp, and you happened to be there, and we just struck up a conversation, and we kind of hit it off. And fast forward to today, and here we are. So, yeah, like I said, I'm really excited to chat Lions. The season sort of came to an abrupt ending, and I think there's a lot to cover. So. It'll be great.
All right. Well, even though it didn't end the way we want, there were some honors that went out. Some we liked the results of, some we didn't. At the NFL honors, the Coach of the Year, the Assistant Coach of the Year, Ben Johnson won Assistant Coach of the Year. I mean, the Lions offense shattered so many records. It was pretty much a landslide victory for him. About 29 or 28 first-place votes. The runners-up were Brian Flores, Vikings defensive coordinator, Aaron Glenn, Lions defensive coordinator. And that's not a surprise either, as both of those guys were highly regarded. And obviously, Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn both are now head coaches. Let's start with that. What are your thoughts on Ben Johnson winning the Assistant Coach of the Year?
Yeah, like you said, I don't really think that should come as a surprise to anybody. Ben Johnson had just an all-around terrific season as the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions. And I think one of the things that stood out to me was just his ability to kind of keep the opponents guessing. We called so many trick plays throughout the season, and the hook and ladder, and just like constantly, like it was just so awesome to see. It made Lions football really entertaining, and I think for that reason, like, he really shined. And so it doesn't come as a surprise to me. And we can chat more about it, but I think well deserved to see him get the head coach gig with the Chicago Bears. So absolutely an awesome sight to see Ben Johnson come away with that award, and also a little bittersweet too,
Yeah, you're glad to see him get that recognition. I'm happy he ran it back with us one more year, because everybody thought he was gone last year.
Definitely.
It's great to have him back. Obviously, don't love that he went somewhere in the division to take that other job. Was hoping it would be anywhere but in the division, but it is what it is. We'll deal with that twice a year.
Absolutely.
Well, let's move over to the award that maybe has some people not totally agreeing on, and that's the Coach of the Year. And Kevin O'Connell from the Minnesota Vikings won this. Second place was Dan Campbell of the Lions, and Dan Quinn pulled in third place for Washington. I've had a few conversations with multiple different people on this one. Have you had a chance to talk about it or process it, or what's your initial reaction to it? First off, let's start with that.
Initial reaction, and I'm going to state the obvious here, but Dan Campbell got snubbed. I mean, Dan Campbell had a fantastic season, head coach of the Detroit Lions, had a 15-win season. It was an outstanding year for them. And, it comes as a surprise to see Kevin O'Connell win it, because make no mistake about it, the Vikings had a good year too. And obviously, like, what Sam Darnold was able to do in his role was remarkable. But I think if you look at it head to head, the Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings squared off, and the Lions won both meetings. So to me, it's puzzling to see O'Connell win that award. And honestly, it doesn't make a ton of sense. But who am I to judge that one?
Yeah, some of the similar lines there, right? To win the Coach of the Year, it feels like a lot of things have to go your way, things you can't even control. Like, I
Right.
feel like if you go back 2 years, the year the Lions went 9-8, if somehow they made the playoffs that year, when they beat Green Bay and they win a game in the playoffs, I think Dan Campbell wins Coach of the Year that year. And then
Absolutely.
some will say, well, the Lions were supposed to be good this year. So that's why he didn't win it, even with the 15 wins. Now, you got to account all those injuries. And I believe that's the reason Kevin Stefanski won it last year, is because the Browns had all those wins and they had Joe
Right.
Flacco and they did all the incredible stuff. And it's like, all right, Dan Campbell did this. Yeah, the offense stayed pretty healthy, but the defense, they cycled through so many different components. And yes, Minnesota, nobody thought they were going to win 14 games this year. I
Right.
completely
That's for
agree
sure.
with that. And I think it all centered around the quarterback play, though. I mean, as I said, I've got my best friend's a Minnesota Vikings fan, and he still thinks Kevin O'Connell should have won the award. But I said to him before the season started, I go, your receiving core was stacked. I go, you upgraded your running game significantly. You brought in some high-priced free agents on the defensive side. You didn't know how they'd fit, but it wasn't like you took the bad news Bears and turned them into a really good team. I mean, they were competitive last year with Nick Mullins at quarterback. And
That's
so
right.
nobody expected, and Josh Dobbs and a couple other guys in between after Kirk Cousins went down. Now, nobody expected Sam Darnold to do what he did. And so that's, and a lot of people thought J.J. McCarthy was going to be the guy by week 7. And obviously that injury happened. But it really feels like, okay, Sam Darnold got him that award by playing that well. And again, it's not like he took an entire roster and built it all up. There were a lot of really good pieces there. And so that's where I kind of go back and forth on. And I go back to what you said. All right, the Lions and the Vikings played each other twice. Dan Campbell, his team was victorious both times, especially week 18 when everything was on the line. There was no doubt who was the better team in that game. And so with a lot of those elements, to me, and obviously being a Lions guy, you have to say, well, it's the homer pick. But I've got coworkers who are Chicago Bears and Pittsburgh Steelers guys, and they both thought it should have been Campbell as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and like I said, if you look at it head to head, Dan Campbell outcoached O'Connell, 2-0. So it just, to me, if you're looking at the numbers and you're looking at the gameplay and all the statistics, I feel it should have been Campbell. And then maybe that might be bias on my end because I am such a big Lions supporter. But I think if you were to crunch the numbers and look at the stats head to head, I mean, I truly feel like Dan Campbell got snubbed. So that's a little bit of a tough pill to swallow, but I think the Lions also maybe have to perform better for Campbell to get that recognition that he deserves.
Yeah, and in some aspects, because expectations are so high already, it'll be near impossible to ever get this award. I mean, I spoke with Chick Hernandez from the Washington area before the Lions played the Commanders. He thought Dan Quinn should be head coach of the year, and he got third place. And I'll say this: I would give it to Dan Quinn before I give it to Kevin O'Connell, because you asked about a team exceeding expectations. Washington went to the NFC Championship game. Now, I'm told it's a regular season award, not a postseason award, but the Minnesota Vikings didn't win the division or a playoff game. I know the Lions didn't win a playoff game, but they did win their division. And so
Right.
I do see Dan Quinn doing that. And my friend who lives in the Washington area, Vikings fan, said, well, was it Dan Quinn or was it his quarterback? And I'm like, well, was it Kevin O'Connell or was it his quarterback? And so I kind of make that fun argument both ways. And so, you can go back and forth. At the end of the day, I don't think this award is the most important award to Dan Campbell or most Lions fans. They would like the recognition, but ultimately, I think you said it, we want the wins and we want to progress in postseason.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head right there. And, if you want to talk about quarterbacks, you can make the same argument. Well, is it Dan Campbell or is it Jared Goff? So I really think that argument could go all the way around. And I'm sure we could debate this topic all night. But yeah, definitely agree. We want to see the wins on the field. And end of the day, I think whether Dan Campbell wins this award or not, it's not going to take away from his legacy too much.
Nope, I don't think it will at all. If anything, it fuels more fandom for him. It's not going to fuel him. He doesn't play or work for this. But the people around him, the fans, everybody, they want, the recognition. And the way to get that, and even if they don't get that recognition, They want the ultimate goal, which is to be playing football in February. Well,
Absolutely.
Right now, get up to a $15 gift card after rebate when you purchase select Superstart batteries exclusively at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Auto Parts.
as we move towards that, I do want to mention that the Detroit Lions Fan of the Year, Megan Stefanski, is now the NFL Fan of the Year. That is pretty incredible. Not just the Detroit Lions, but the NFL Fan of the Year. And again, every team puts up their Fan of the Year. There's voting throughout most of the season, and she was the winner, and she was at the Super Bowl. And so let's slide right into Super Bowl thoughts here, Cam. Philly won 40-22 over Kansas City. What's your first initial reaction to that now the results are out there and you got to see the game?
Initially going into the Super Bowl, I wasn't excited because I did not want to see the Chiefs win it 3 years in a row. And then on the other end, I hate the Eagles. So I really didn't want to see them do too well either, especially because I felt like the Lions could have easily been there had they not been decimated by all those injuries. It was theirs for the taking, And so I think this Super Bowl compared to years past, I was not as excited to watch it. But I think, from a game perspective, it was an entertaining game. And I think the number one thing that stood out to me the most is how much the Chiefs struggled. I mean, Patrick Mahomes was flustered most of the game, and he really, really struggled to produce, and he really struggled to do anything meaningful on offense. And I think just the Chiefs as a whole were really, really stagnant. And then, you talk about the Eagles on the other hand, they were just completely dominant in all facets of the game. I mean, Jalen Hurts was fantastic. Cooper DeJean was fantastic. The coaching decisions were great. And really, the Eagles dominated. And, I was watching the game with my fiance, and I think we knew by about halftime, yeah, this one's over. And it was the Eagles, put it in drive and really didn't look back. And so definitely not the best Super Bowl I've ever watched. But, the number one thing I can take away from it is the Lions and the Eagles are going to have some interesting battles over the next couple of years because I don't see the Eagles going away. They're that good right now, and they're the kings of the NFC. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the Lions are able to perform against the Eagles in years to come.
Yeah, going into the game, I expected it to be a close game. And my reaction was at first I was surprised it was pretty lopsided. But then I reflected on it, and it really shouldn't be a shock. I mean, they say hindsight's 50-50, right? Half the time you're right, half the time you're wrong. And the reality is Kansas City squeaked by a lot of games this year, and we knew that going in. But we just kept giving them the bye, giving them the pass for it. It's hey, they got Andy Reid. They got great coaching. But they never scored more than 30 points on offense until the AFC Championship game against the Bills. That's the only time. And their talent level, it really was depleted, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, their running game was virtually non-existent. Their top two rushers averaged 3.6 and 3.7 yards a carry. That's 2 yards less a carry than Jahmyr Gibbs averages, right? And receiving-wise, Hollywood Brown, Rashee Rice, those injuries really hurt them. So if you look at it, you're that's a lot to overcome. Now, when you're playing regular season games, that's one thing. But we're in the Super Bowl now, and that Philadelphia roster is stacked. It was loaded. I mean, they made one of the best offseason moves to coincide with one of the New York Giants' worst offseason moves, which was bringing in Saquon Barkley, and it just elevated everything that much more. So it shouldn't have been a shock, but it's man, how did I miss that,
Absolutely. And, to your point about bringing Saquon in, I mean, he had an okay game, but he was no means the star of the show. And I think that's what kind of stood out to me is look how good the Eagles are, even when Saquon's not doing a ton on offense. And so it speaks volumes, man. I mean, I think the Eagles are just going to be a force to be reckoned with in the NFC here for years to come. Jalen Hurts is showing no signs of kind of slowing down anytime soon. And yeah, to your point, I just think this wasn't the Chiefs' year, especially just seeing how they performed in the Super Bowl. It was so lopsided, and Mahomes just seemed like he could never really get comfortable, and Kelsey didn't do too much, and it just man, it was definitely surprising to see because I think if you had me pick who I thought was going to win. I probably would have predicted the Chiefs would have been victorious for the third year in a row, but to see the Eagles win and to see them do it in such a lopsided fashion was definitely an interesting thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I'm gonna compare this to a couple Denver Broncos Super Bowls, right? 11 years ago, they came in with Peyton Manning against Seattle, and everyone thought, "Wow, Denver's offense." But what happened? Seattle just destroyed them. But I'll even go further back. I'm gonna make a John Elway comparison here. In the 1988 Super Bowl, the Broncos lost to Washington 42-10, and I bring that one up because John Elway kind of was carrying the team in those early years. And in some ways, if you really look at this, Patrick Mahomes helped carry the offense a lot. Now, the defense did a lot of work to get them there because they won a lot of those games without having to score too many points. But you could ultimately see the flaws in this team in the Super Bowl. And here's the crazy idea. Maybe Andy Reid should have won Coach of the Year for winning that many games with this roster and getting to the Super Bowl. So just some crazy thoughts right there. It's a pretty darn impressive job that they've gone and now went to the Super Bowl 3 years in a row after getting rid of Tyreek Hill and some other talented guys off that roster.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is just like no matter, even if the Chiefs have a down year, they're still going to be up there and they're still going to be kind of like you recognize like it's going to be the Chiefs, it's going to be the Bills. And no matter which way you slice it, it's going to be a tough path to get the Super Bowl victory, unless of course you're the Eagles this year. So yeah, and love the comparison to obviously the John Elway predates me a little bit, but any player can show up and any player can not show up. And I think that's exactly what we kind of saw in the lopsided Super Bowl this year. So really, really interesting game. And, I'd be lying if I said that the Chiefs won't be back and the Eagles won't be back. I could very easily see them up there in contention for next year's Super Bowl, but definitely an interesting one this year. And, I didn't mind watching it. I wasn't super excited going into it, but I think, after it was all said and done, it was an interesting way to spend my Sunday night.
All right, well, let's stop talking about other teams, at least without mentioning the Lions, because this is a Lions podcast. And let's bring up the Super Bowl aspect. A couple things. One is, I saw a lot of things on social media saying, man, the Lions could have beaten the Chiefs. They should have beaten the Chiefs. They should have been there. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but the question is, could they have beaten this Philadelphia team to get there in the condition the roster was in? And so I don't know that they could have. I would have loved to have seen that game. That's a game I really wanted to see. Let me hear your thoughts, and I'll share my thoughts on it.
This is a tough one for me because I think it just brings the question of with the Lions healthy, I think they run away with the game. I think they beat the Eagles. I think they march to the Super Bowl, no problem. You have a healthy Hutchinson, you have healthy David Montgomery and, Aleem McNeil and countless other pieces on the roster. I think if fully healthy, yes, the Lions go to the Super Bowl, no question. And yes, I think they beat the Chiefs. I really do. And, I'll kind of die on that hill. But I think with the current state of the roster, with all the injuries, with the rumors of Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn leaving, it's just like all those things kind of disrupted the Lions' groove at the end of the season. And I agree with you, and I think I agree with you, and I don't think that the Lions would beat the Eagles in the state that they were in. And that Eagles team was just really good. We saw it all through the regular season, all through the playoffs, and obviously all the way to the top to the Super Bowl. And so I agree with you. I would have loved to see that matchup. I think it would have been great football, but it's one of those things I guess we'll never know. And it's really interesting because it's now a matchup that could be in the cards next season too, which would be super interesting to see.
For sure. Yeah, I'm going to say it would have taken like a perfect game for the Lions to beat them. It could have happened, but especially with Amik Robertson going down in the divisional round, that secondary was so depleted. It would have taken a near perfect game by the offense for that. A game I still would have liked to have seen. And, we do play them next year on the road. I did say as soon as we knew that Kansas City and Philadelphia were going to be in the Super Bowl, I said, I think the Lions are going to open the season on Thursday Night Football against the winner because we play both of those teams on the road. We have an atrocious road schedule next year. I don't know if atrocious is the right word, but on paper, it looks extremely difficult. Philly, that they've got like 8 different teams to choose from for that home game, and the Lions are one of them. We'll see if that happens to be it. All right, talking about Super Bowl results. Okay, now that Philly won that game, and they did it with a 4-man rush. Okay, they put a lot of pressure on, dropping 7, only rushing 4. Myles Garrett. Everyone's talking Myles Garrett, Myles Garrett. Cameron, we talked about this on our last show. You know, I'm not against having him. Most of the guys of us, we're not, but we're not willing to give up all those draft picks and pay that huge contract, especially with some of our own guys having to be paid so soon. But I want to hear your thoughts. I know you've had some time to think about it. You've seen stuff out there. What are your thoughts on a guy like Myles Garrett, or you can even throw Max Crosby into the conversation if you want to?
So here's my thoughts on Myles Garrett. He comes out, he tells the Cleveland Browns, I don't want to be part of this organization anymore. The team that drafted him, you got to trade me. I want to go play for a winner. And I think you look at it from the position of, if you're Brad Holmes, the Lions GM, you're sitting there licking your chops because you could potentially get one of the best DEs on the market. And I know that Brad Holmes is of the mentality draft and develop. But if you're serious about winning now and taking that next step to elevate the team, I think you got to go out and get Myles Garrett. Now, as for the price tag, it's going to be interesting. I've seen a lot of rumors online and a lot of possible trades. A first round this year, a first round next year, a second round. Do you throw in a Hendon Hooker? Do you throw in a Jameson Williams? And I think if you're serious about contending and getting to the Super Bowl and getting to the top, I think you got to go out and get Myles Garrett, whatever the price tag is. And I don't know if that's a popular opinion or an unpopular opinion, but I think you need to get somebody that can complement Hutch on the edge. And I think with Myles Garrett and Hutch, both on your defensive edge, that's dominant. I mean, that positions the defense to be absolutely stellar for years to come. And I think the Lions were sorely missing another presence in the absence of Hutch on defense. You know, you go out, you get Zadarius Smith, who underwhelmed in his tenure with the Lions, and it kind of remains to be seen whether he'll be brought back or what his status is going to be going into next season. But I think if you're serious, you got to go out and you got to get a bona fide guy like Myles Garrett. And, you know, just quickly to your point about Max Crosby, I'm an Eastern Michigan alum. Max Crosby played at EMU. Now he's with the Raiders, and he's silently, I feel like he's a fan of the Lions from afar. You know, he posted on Twitter earlier this week that he's excited to see the Pistons doing well. And so as cool as I think it would be to get Max Crosby in Detroit, I don't think it happens. I just don't think that's in the cards right now. I think if it was going to happen, it already would have. But I really think, like, looking at those two kind of options, I think Myles Garrett is much more realistic for Detroit. So I would love it. I think that's like the next move that the Lions must make if they're serious about contention. But definitely want to get your thoughts. I want to hear what you have to say, because I know this is like a super hot topic in the NFL world right now.
Well, the Max Crosby thing, I agree. He's not coming. I think the Pete Carroll hire just ended any chance of that, because that's going to get him fired up. And again, the whole trading picks to pay somebody top dollar is a double price tag to me. You know, I would almost rather take, you know, you're gonna have to give up 2 first-round picks. I'd almost rather give up your first-round pick from 2026 and your 2025 first-round pick and move up way up in the first round this year and get a high draft pick that's a defensive end. Now, is that guy going to be Myles Garrett? No, probably not. But whoever that is, you're hoping they're going to be really good, and you're going to get them on the rookie wage scale for 4 years. Because, Cameron, if you do this move, and Myles Garrett's going to want a new contract. I mean, the 2 years he has on there is great. If they can do it and keep it for the 2 years, hey, if Brad Holmes finds a way to make it happen, you will not see me complain. I would love him on that team. But can we re-sign Kirby Joseph and Jameson Williams 2 years from now if we make this move? That's my question for you. Knowing that could jeopardize that, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, here's the thing about that. You know, Brad Holmes is very much the draft and develop kind of guy, and he rewards his guys for performing well. I mean, look at Aleem McNeil. He played well. He got that contract, and, you know, you could name other players on the roster who are in the same position. So I think if you're Brad Holmes, you don't want to stunt your development and your cap situation for future players. But I think from a perspective of somebody that desperately wants to see this team win, I'm fine if you let Kirby Joseph walk. I'm fine if you lose Jameson Williams, because if you can go out and you can get Myles Garrett and he can help you immediately get to where you want to be, then I'm fine with it. Brad Holmes, completely different story. But if you're asking me point blank, I'm fine with it. I don't mind. I'd love to see us pay Jamison Williams and Kirby Joseph and Brian Branch and all these guys who are in the pipeline and kind of like next up on the sort of on the fringe of stardom. I'd love it. I think it's great. I think you need to, and the Lions have shown the willingness to do that. But I also think if you're serious about winning and you want somebody that's going to tip the scale, then Myles Garrett is that guy.
All right. No doubt that he would tip the scale. I would rather play I don't want to say play the long games. It seems like we've been doing that for 50 some years or more, right? With the Lions here. But the way I look at the postseason is it takes a lot to get there and a lot of hard work, but there's no guarantees. And you're rarely ever just one player away from winning a Super Bowl. Now, the Rams may be the exception, but they're not the exception. People say, oh, they traded for Stafford and they won the Super Bowl. Yeah, but they didn't just trade for Stafford. Halfway through Stafford's year, they went and got OBJ, and they got Von Miller. They brought in guys to help. Without those guys, they're not making the Super Bowl. And so they brought in multiple players. And so even if you get in the playoffs, as we see and saw this year, it takes some luck in the playoffs. You know, Washington needed Tampa to turn the ball over to win that game against Tampa. If Tampa doesn't turn the ball over, Washington's probably not winning that game. The Lions turned the ball over 5 times. If they turn the ball over 3 times, they might win that game. And so my point being, I'd rather keep the window open and keep the roster being built versus potentially letting a couple key pieces jettison early to bring somebody in for that shorter window. Because I do think I'm not opposed to bringing a guy in, but I'd rather do it the DJ Reader style, which is you bring in a free agent who's like a mid to high level free agent versus the marquee name with the highest amount. Somebody that's going to be a quality starter, who could be a quality starter, and you never know what you're going to get with a free agent, because that's the great thing about rewarding the guys that have been there 2 to 3 years. You know so many things about them because, like you pointed out, if someone's posting on social media they want out, well, is that a guy you want in? You know?
Yeah, that's definitely valid and totally respect where you're coming from. I think that's like a completely fair argument to make. And the way I look at it is like, this is the closest that the Lions have been in my lifetime and in your lifetime too.
Yep.
And like you said, it's you're not one player away, but I do think Myles Garrett would be a huge difference maker. And so you get Myles Garrett and maybe you get a couple other key acquisitions in the offseason or sign a couple, like you said, mid-level kind of top tier free agents. And then I think you're there. So, I want to kind of go back to what you said too. I do think that Myles Garrett is going to be an investment where if you do trade him, you're going to have to lock him up too, because he's not going to be a one and done type guy. So you bring him in, you give up the draft capital, you give up some of your younger players potentially, or like you said, you let some of your younger guys walk, and then he's going to want to get that payday as well. And so it's interesting to me because we've never seen Brad Holmes really go out and get that marquee guy, that big name free agent. Since he's really been here, that's just not the name of his game. He's more so the draft and develop style, the take on a little bit of a project guy in the draft and see how he does and that sort of thing. And so I don't think it's his MO. And as much as I would like to see Myles Garrett, it does feel like a little bit of a stretch. But, Matthew, if we can somehow pull it off, I would be one happy camper,
Oh, for sure. I don't disagree with that. A lot of people would love to see an incredible second defensive end on the other side of that line. I do think Brad Holmes has made some moves, though, that he should get credit for. Like, I'm going to tell you that my favorite one was David Montgomery. Okay, when he made that move 2 years ago, I think I was probably just as excited as Brad Holmes, and that's probably next to impossible. But he was the best free agent running back on the market that year. I could not believe the Chicago Bears let him walk, and we got him, and that was huge. And, he's rewarding homegrown talent as well. So, or guys we've acquired. And so we are making free agent signings or extensions, but they're our own guys. And so that's why it doesn't seem like such a splash play. But also, one injury, I mean, if you give up all those resources for a guy like Myles Garrett, and you have that one injury, all that has then been neutralized. And I want to do the Philadelphia move. How many draft picks did they give up for Saquon Barkley? 0. Which also, I mean, it takes another franchise being inept for something like that to happen, but apparently that happens. And, you know, the Lions did trade a 3rd-round pick last year for a very good defensive player in Carlton Davis. And that was huge because they had a veteran number 1 defensive back. And without him, our secondary looks different from day one. And we were so much better the first 2/3 of the season because of him. And we gave up a 3rd-round pick. I hope we re-sign him. That would be my favorite free agent signing this offseason, is bringing Carlton Davis back. Because if you don't bring him back, you're going to have to bring in somebody else in the defensive backfield that's got a veteran presence. So it's a complicated thing. There are so many moving parts to this. Am I opposed to them bringing in a well-known name in the second half of their career as a defensive end? No, I'm not. I want some talent in there that's not a rookie. I do hope they do draft the line. I wouldn't be shocked if they do. They've done it multiple times in the past. But it's a complicated thing. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it all comes together. Any other thoughts on that defensive line?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that they're going to definitely be looking at what defensive talent they can get in the draft, and I think they're going to prioritize that because I think that the defense was a weaker link, especially later on in the season after we did suffer all those injuries. And so I think that Brad is going to be kind of prioritizing that in the draft. And, we can talk mock draft if you want, but I think that there are a lot of promising names out there. But then I agree with you. A guy like Carlton Davis was a huge difference maker. Amik Robertson, huge difference maker for the Lions on defense. And those are guys, veteran guys that have been in the league, that are proven, that established, and they're not rookies. So you kind of know a little bit what you're going to get from them. And I think they were stellar. I mean, I love Carlton Davis. I think that would be a great move to bring him back. Amik Robertson was fantastic. It's interesting. We had a chance to speak with him on the Detroit Lions Lone Wolves podcast that I do, and he was super down to earth and really great and super excited for the playoffs. And then he goes out and suffers that devastating arm injury. And so that was really horrible to see. And, it was cool to get to talk to him, and then you're kind of rooting for him, and then that injury happens. And so, I think the defense is definitely a big question mark for the Lions going forward, but I have faith that Brad Holmes will do what he needs to do to keep them on track. And, I love to see when that Lions defense is really just like feasting and playing at the top of their game. I mean, I think that's what we all want to see. And so definitely hoping for more of that next season.
Yeah, for sure. And there's always going to be a lot of roster turnover, right? Coach Andrews, who's on our show, talked about it, and I forget the number he threw out, but there's a large percentage of average roster turnover every year in the NFL. And, keep in mind with Philadelphia, yes, they did make that trade for A.J. Brown a couple years ago because they found a willing trade partner that just, the Titans just wanted to let him go. But when they brought in Saquon Barkley, caused 0 draft picks. They got C.J. Gardner-Johnson back from the Lions, did not cost any draft picks. And a lot of their defensive players are guys they actually drafted. And so those things built up. You don't always win by making trades. Now, sometimes those are important, like the Lions getting Carlton Davis. They gave up a 3rd-round pick. You got immediate dividends right there.
Right.
Again, the free agent route, I'm okay with that. I think in the last episode, we talked about Trey Hendrickson, and I think we mentioned he might have been a free agent. I think he's got another year left on his contract, so he's not a free agent yet. But I'm okay with bringing in a guy on the defensive line or two, whether it's draft and free agency, because, again, Aleem McNeil's recovery time's in question. That there's going to be some changes on that defensive line. Don't know if all the contracts will get picked back up, if some of the guys that are now free agents will get brought back. And but hopefully, anybody that does come to Detroit will have a different opinion than what C.J. Gardner-Johnson had, because he said his time in Detroit was horrible. And I'm going to maybe give him the benefit of the doubt and say it was all clouded by the fact that he was injured the whole time. Because if you're injured almost the whole time, it's not going to be the funnest time there. But did you hear those remarks?
Yeah, so CJ Gardner Johnson comes out. He says his time in Detroit was quote unquote hell. It really didn't make a lot of sense to me because I felt like he was somebody that kind of always was running his mouth and kind of always chirping. And then you go out against the 49ers and he just kind of laid an egg. He just really wasn't good and, struggled with the torn pec throughout the season and seemed like he was pretty happy to depart from the Lions. And then he comes out and he says the time here was horrible. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think from a fan perspective, it's somebody that like I kind of just, wipe the floor with, like kind of good riddance, and kind of a guy that you don't want to see go back to the Eagles and win a ring, and it's kind of a guy you want to root against a little bit. But yeah, that was weird. It really didn't make a ton of sense to me, and I just felt like you're probably in the minority of feeling like that because a lot of the guys love the culture that the Lions are building and the whole bite the kneecaps thing, and they love playing for Coach Campbell. So it's like Gardner Johnson goes out and says that, and it's like I don't know if you're going to find too many teammates that are going to agree with you on that. So definitely it was a little bit puzzling and just bizarre to see. So yeah, I don't know about that one.
Yeah, I know. I was super excited when we signed him as a free agent, and I think that's the one Brad Holmes was elated about. And obviously that injury was a big damper. I think it was in week 2, and he worked his way back, and he got back to the playoffs. Again, things didn't work the way we wanted to. I appreciated him being here. It didn't work out. We moved on, and I'm going to say I'm happy the blue ski mask thing didn't work out either. I was never a fan of that from the beginning. I was at the game when that thing was trying to take off, and I'm glad that thing just landed.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. That was weird. And, I think looking at kind of the history of Brad Holmes, he's notorious for taking on some of those like reclamation project type guys where you're a CJ Gardner Johnson and you want to kind of come in and make an impact and kind of bounce back from whatever you got going on. And I think another example of this is like a guy like Emmanuel Mosley, who you bring in kind of a low risk guy, you give him a chance. He's been dealing with some injuries, and that's another one that just like, to me, hasn't really worked out. But you don't see Emmanuel Mosley going on and saying my time here is horrible. So it's interesting. Again, I'm kind of with you. I appreciated what Gardner Johnson brought, but like now that he's gone, I'm like, okay, whatever. You do your thing and we'll do ours.
there you go. Well, changes keep coming. We've gone over a lot of the coaching changes, but that didn't slow down. The Lions made a couple more. They're hiring Tyler Roll. He's a longtime assistant at North Dakota State, and I believe also at Iowa State. And the Lions are hiring him on the offensive coaching staff. That first was reported that I saw by Matt Zenitz of CBS Sports. And so that will just add one more guy to the coaching staff because the Lions have had a lot of guys move around. So he is going to be their tight ends coach. So that'll be another guy in the room. And a name more people will recognize is Tashard Choice. He is a former running back. He coached most recently at Texas, but he was actually at Georgia Tech with Jahmyr Gibbs. Oh, and by the way, when he was at Texas, he had a guy named Bijan Robinson working with him. And so I actually found a nice article on NFL.com from 2 years ago by Eric Edholm. He talked about the rapport that Choice and Gibbs had back then at Georgia Tech. Cameron, I'm really excited for this pairing. I think it's going to be a great combination.
Matthew, I think this is going to be a fantastic move, a little bit of an under the radar move too. I mean, bringing him back to work with Jahmyr Gibbs, who has already demonstrated that he has the potential to be elite, to be a superstar, to be a stud running back in this league. I think this move is absolutely genius to reunite him with a coach that helped him develop so much in his college days. I love it. I think it's a slam dunk. I think it's fantastic. And I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to take a huge step forward next season.
Well, and then that's saying a lot because he already took a huge step forward this season. And it's interesting because, again, Choice was there at Georgia Tech. They both left Georgia Tech and went different directions, and now they're back together again. So that history, which was a positive history, can only just help pay dividends. And Choice saw something in him and learned something about Gibbs early on that I think this has a potential to, like you said, be a really good story.
Absolutely. I'm really, really excited to see kind of the step that Jahmyr Gibbs takes next season. I mean, we've talked about his performance this year, and the just the pairing of him and David Montgomery as the whole Sonic and Knuckles thing. I mean, that's going to be so awesome to see, and I think that was like a huge bright spot for the Lions this past year. And so I think this move is a slam dunk, and it really is going to bode well for that running back room going forward. And I just want to mention too, in light of the departures of Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson, I really like the hire of John Morton as the offensive coordinator, and then elevating Kelvin Shepherd to your DC is a great move too. And I think you kind of get that outside perspective, and then you elevate from within on the defensive side of the ball. And I think like those coaching moves are going to pay off. I was really sad to lose Ben Johnson, and I was sad to see Aaron Glenn go, but I think the Lions have kind of patched those holes in the best way that they could, and I think it will be really interesting to see kind of how this machine moves forward. You mentioned they've undergone so much turnover on the coaching staff this offseason, and obviously like Antoine Randall is gone too, and so Terrell Williams is another one, and I just think this kind of retooled Lions coaching staff is going to be really, really interesting to keep an eye on next season.
For sure. And, if we want to talk about coaches and coaching staffs, there's a former Detroit Lions coach in the news, and that is none other than Matt Patricia. And he's getting a coaching opportunity here, and it might actually be one that most Lions fans are okay with. Cameron, he's going to Ohio State. What are your thoughts on this?
So, as a Lions fan, I don't mind it. As a Michigan fan, different story. I'm as big of a Michigan fan as they come. I've been fortunate enough to photograph a couple of Michigan football games this past season, and I think as a Michigan supporter, Michigan fan, Michigan photographer, whatever you want to call me, I hate it. I want to see him crash and burn. I want to just absolutely stomp on him when the Wolverines play Ohio State, and it's great as a Lions fan. It's not so great as a Michigan fan, and that's just like my quick thoughts on it. But I just want to crush him, and I think like even more so because of kind of how he set the Lions back. I just want to like go in there and just crush him like even more just for that reason.
But wait a minute here. I'm confused because you're a Michigan fan. He's going to the team that you've kind of been crushing recently. I mean, it's better than him becoming the Michigan defensive coordinator, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Definitely, definitely. I'd much rather see him at Ohio State. I mean, it's easier to hate him when he goes to Ohio State versus hating him when he's at Michigan. So definitely, I just is the type of guy I hated him in Detroit. I hate him in Ohio State, and I just want to beat him like as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, he's an interesting one. I've never met him or spoken with him, but I've heard, individually, one-on-one, he was one type of person, and a person who a lot of people actually spoke highly of. But then in a team or group setting, I heard it was basically a 180 complete opposite. And so from the stories I've heard, I mean, as a Lions head coach, not a fan at all. And so happy that he is gone. And some of the stories that former players, even some I've interviewed, have shared, it wasn't part of a healthy culture. So I can't help but wonder, all right, what's better? I mean, the Matt Patricia going to Ohio State, that doesn't bother me at all. I guess what bothered me more was when Matt Millen came back to Michigan, and the state of Michigan, and he was a broadcaster for games at U of M. And you're sitting here watching a U of M game, and you have to listen to Matt Millen call games. And so that was a tough one for Lions fans as well as those of us who remember the Matt Millen era.
Absolutely. And, I just think like with Matt Patricia, I go back to that like photo of him driving like the golf cart around training camp. And then you've got a guy like Dan Campbell, who's literally out there doing the up downs with his players. And I think that that's just the difference in like the whole Matty P era versus the Dan Campbell bite your kneecaps era. And so like, I'm with you. I'm not a Matt Patricia guy. I'm not a fan of him. Never was, never will be. And so he can pack his bags and go down to college and stay there and be out of the NFL for all I care.
It just dawned on me. We said Matt Millen. We got Matt Patricia. Maybe I go by Matthew because I don't want to be associated with the Matts. I mean, you put me by Matt Prater, I'll take that. And Matthew Stafford, hey, I'm still a fan of Matthew Stafford. I loved everything he did in Detroit. I don't root for him now. I'll cheer him once he retires and whatnot. But I was at that playoff game against the Rams, and I was part of that group chanting Jared Goff because he's our quarterback now. But yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, we need another good Matt or Matthew to come to Detroit just to help balance those numbers out.
That's right. I'll give you that. But hey, I'm not gonna put you in the same group as Matt Millen or Matt Patricia. So I think you've got those guys beat.
No, I appreciate that. Well, Cameron, we are in the off season. Okay, so let me get your thoughts on a couple more Detroit Lions topics here before we get out of here. The season ended unexpectedly for us, at least 1 week earlier than anticipated. So, because that happened, what I've seen on social media is a lot of people think the Lions need a big change. Okay, I ask you, do they need to make a big change?
So let me give you my thoughts on this topic. I mean, we've already kind of covered the Myles Garrett thing. That feels like a big change, a big move, a splash to me. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen. But I'm going to take this question a different route. I think what the Lions really need to do is shore up their backup QB situation. And let me tell you why. You have Hendon Hooker as your backup QB all season. We saw a little bit of him here and there. I believe he played against the Titans a little bit. And then before the playoffs, Teddy Bridgewater comes back. He comes out of retirement. He comes back on the team. They say he's going to be in a mentorship role and he's going to be kind of tutoring Hooker, and he'll fill in if whatever happens to Goff. And then Goff goes down in the playoffs, and you're expecting Hendon Hooker to come into the game, and lo and behold, it's Teddy Bridgewater. And I think I speak for a lot of Lions supporters when I say, like, that was super confusing, and it makes you question whether or not the Lions trust Hendon Hooker. And I'm of the belief that he hasn't really done enough. He hasn't really shown us enough to prove that he is the number 2 guy. And if Jared Goff goes down, do you trust Hendon Hooker? I don't. I don't feel comfortable with him as my QB. And so for that reason, I think that the Lions should invest in a more established backup quarterback. And I think you either trade Hooker in a deal for Garrett or potentially some other move, or you just slot him as your 3rd guy, or you put him on the practice squad or something. But I think one of the must-have moves for me this offseason is the Lions need to get a more dependable backup quarterback. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with some of what you say, and I disagree with some. So let's have some banter here. Let's start with what do we know we have in Hendon Hooker? As a fan, as somebody from the outside, I think the answer is we don't know. I think that's the big thing, because he was injured that first year. This past year, I think he got a concussion in preseason, so he hardly played in preseason. So we just haven't seen a lot of him. And because of all that, his growth has been slowed. Now, I know he's also an older quarterback as well for being a younger guy in the league. Teddy Bridgewater, him coming in the playoffs, that doesn't shock me at all. Them bringing him in does not shock me, because you wanted a veteran, a guy with experience, a guy who can help Jared Goff with the film sessions, but also, if Jared Goff had to go out in a game, in the playoff game especially, you don't want that young of a player, that inexperienced of a player having to fill in. And so I was totally fine with it. It made total sense to me. I'd be okay if history repeats itself again this year with Teddy Bridgewater. Now, where does that leave us with Hendon Hooker? The answer is, I think nobody outside the building knows. Inside the building, they might have an idea. And I think what you need to do is you need to see another offseason, another training camp, and another preseason from Hendon. I think we still don't know what we have. And could he become a player like a Jordan Love, who sat for multiple years and then developed into a starter? I don't know that answer. I also know with Jared Goff being here as long as he is, I don't know that Hendon Hooker is going to see a second contract here. That's a whole nother discussion, and that can take us into a lot of different directions. But I also think the Lions like the fact that they can pay their backup quarterback such little money to save that salary cap spot to put on another defensive back or add to the defensive line. So I think there's a lot of parts that come into it. Now, would you tell me, if you said, hey, would you rather have Sam Darnold as your backup quarterback? I mean, this was even before a year ago. I would have taken him as our backup because of the experience he had. Obviously, this year, Sam Darnold's going to be a starter somewhere for somebody. And I don't know if it'll be a bidding war or what will happen with that. But would I like a more experienced guy as a backup? Yes, I would. But I would like that more if our quarterback was missing an average of 4 to 5 games a year. With Jared Goff's stability, I mean, look who the Kansas City Chiefs had as their backup, Chad Henne, for how many years, right? And the hope is you don't have that guy in there, and they can be there for a variety of reasons. But I'm good with rolling with Hendon this year as our number 2. And I wouldn't be opposed to them bringing in somebody else late in the draft or another free agent just to try somebody else out there. I think they've already done a futures deal with Jake Fromm to bring him back. But I think it's a position I'm okay with staying the way it is. But I hear some of that. Does it change any of your thoughts? Are you still cemented that way? And again, it's a healthy debate.
You know, and here's the thing, Matthew, is I'm with you and I'm not with you. I'm fine with, I think Hendon Hooker has a little bit longer of a leash. I'm not ready to give up on him just yet, but I think that this next year is going to be key. And I think it's going to be key to see what he does this offseason and see how he comes into training camp. Is he ready? Is he healthy? Is he ready to potentially, run the show if something does happen to Goff? Not that I think it will, because Goff has proven that he's pretty durable and pretty stable, and obviously he's not going anywhere with his contract situation. So, I'm with you. I'm not ready to give up on him just yet, but I think if you were to bring in a more established, more reputable veteran quarterback, maybe you challenge Hendon a little bit and you say, okay, we're going to bring this guy in just to kind of let you know we've got our eye on you and see what happens. I think that this is going to really be kind of that make or break year for him. And so it'll be really, really interesting to see what happens. That's one thing that I'm like hyper fixated on for the Lions kind of going forward. And so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
That is for sure. And Dan Campbell does not give false praise on anybody. And when asked about Hendon Hooker, he said, he's taking steps forward. He's doing things, but he hasn't given glowing reviews. So yeah, there's definitely, it sounds like, work to be done. And I think training camp and preseason is going to tell us a big story here.
Yep, it's going to be essential to see how he fares and to see if if the Lions will put that trust in him. And I want to just go back quickly to one thing we touched on earlier in the show. Hendon Hooker is a classic example of a sort of like a reclamation gamble that Brad Holmes took a gamble on. He was injured and you kind of bring him in and you sit for a year and you rehab and you get healthy, and then it's like it sets back his development a little bit further, and so he's not ready. In a similar way of like a guy like J.J. McCarthy. I mean, we expected him to come in and be ready to go, and he's lost a whole year due to injury, and Hendon Hooker was very much in the same position. And so I think because of that, he's gotten sort of off to a shaky start in his NFL career. So again, it'll just be really interesting to see what happens with him and if he's able to contribute really with the Lions or elsewhere.
All right, well, speaking of guys who contribute, the Lions are going to need to bring some guys back. They have like 22 unrestricted free agents, I think. Is there a player or two you are hoping the Lions prioritize that they bring back out of those guys? And I don't know if you know who all the free agents are, but they've got a pretty large list there, and I can go through some of them if you want.
Yeah, throw out some names, but I want to start with one name in particular that I know is we're kind of on the fence here, and that guy is Ifeatu Melifonwu. And I think that he is a really interesting case because he's shown some flashes of being really good, but then he's also been injured. He's not been healthy. There's been other games where he just like hasn't contributed. And so that's a guy that I'm kind of torn on. Like, I'd like to see the Lions give him another chance, but then also if you lose him, it's not really going to break the team too much. And so that's one that I would like to maybe see them kind of re-sign him, maybe give him one more shot, another 1-year deal, or a kind of a prove it year to see what you can get from him. But that's definitely one name that I would consider bringing back.
All right, and yeah, the other ones, I'll throw the starters out. You've got Carlton Davis, linebacker Derek Barnes, defensive lineman Levi Onwuzurike, Marcus Davenport, Kevin Zeitler on the offense, and Tim Patrick. Any of those guys that you're like, hey, you really want to bring this guy back?
So Tim Patrick's really interesting. You get Tim Patrick, he comes in, he's kind of your third receiver. I think he had a fantastic season. I don't think many people expected to get too much out of him. He's kind of an older guy, a veteran guy, and I think he was really, really solid as that kind of third wideout for the Lions. And so I really like him. I would be happy to bring him back, and I don't think he'll break the bank too much. And then I want to talk about another name that you mentioned, which is Kevin Zeitler. And he's interesting because I think that he was a guy that was like sort of an under the radar signing. He didn't get too much fanfare when we initially picked him up. And he's a guy that I think I'm okay with losing. And I'll tell you, I think Christian Mahogany is ready to kind of take that next step and fill in at that guard position and be that guy. And so as solid as Zeitler was, I think you can let him go. I think you can walk, and I think you have like a pretty comfortable replacement in Mahogany. So, as far as the other names you mentioned, Marcus Davenport is a guy that, like, again, he couldn't really stay healthy, and you didn't get too much for him. But we talked about it earlier. Carlton Davis, I would love to bring him back. Another guy that's like proven, and he was a good contributor for Detroit before he got injured, and so that's a guy that I would like to see give another chance to, definitely.
All right, and then bringing guys in. They always bring in new people, whether it's free agency or the draft. Is there one or two positions? It sounds like quarterback might be one that you're hoping they bring somebody in for the backup, but one or two spots that you hope the Lions prioritize in getting help. I think the other one's probably the defensive line, but you tell me.
Yeah, definitely quarterback. Like I said, bring in a veteran guy to challenge Hooker a little bit, or just see what you get from Hooker next year and see how he develops. But definitely that. I think that they'll at least bring another guy into camp, whether it's a Jake Fromm or just a veteran guy that you see how he does, throw him on the practice squad or cut him late in training camp and just kind of see what you get out of that quarterback room. But then obviously on defense, you need to kind of shore up that defense, whether you do that through the draft or you bring in a capable defensive guy to add to that defensive line. I think those are my kind of two must-have positions for what's on my wish list for the Lions this offseason.
All right, sounds good. The other day I got to actually participate in a Zoom call with John Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown's dad. Osiris St. Brown was on the call as well. Again, I was just kind of one of the group of people who got to ask some questions. I actually just kind of listened, didn't ask any of the questions, but it was pretty cool. I got some fun insights from John. I think a couple of the things he said was they asked when Equinemius and Amon-Ra were both in the same division, what was it like? And he said it was a family fun rivalry. It wasn't too crazy or anything like that. John said he actually, his dream would have been to have all three of his kids wide receivers on the Detroit Lions, all on the same team. To get, Osiris was great in college. He had some injury issues, I think, with his foot, if I recall correctly. But he would have liked to have all three of them on the same pro team. And so that would have been incredible to get three brothers all on the same team. I don't know if there's I should do my research to see if there's been two brothers that have played together on a team or not. I'm sure there has. I know we have in baseball, but do you recall any offhand? I have not done any research on this.
I'm gonna go Julian and Romeo Okwara from a couple of years ago.
My gosh, how did I miss the obvious one with the Lions right there?
That's right. I'm gonna throw those names at you, but yeah. Other than that, I don't know too many. But I agree with you. That would have been so cool to see, and just a super cool thing to see. I feel like you don't see that a ton. I mean, it's more common in the NBA and maybe the MLB, but yeah, definitely NFL. That's super cool.
As long as my memory doesn't fail me on this one, I do remember. I believe it was Byron Sanders was trying out for the Detroit Lions with his brother Barry, and Byron did not make it out of preseason. But at one point, there were a couple Sanders there, so that would have been something as well.
And it's interesting because I believe Chauncey Billups had a brother who was like on like the summer league for the Pistons and trying to grab a roster spot several years ago in the going to work era. But that was another one that's like, what could have been kind of thing.
Well, speaking about what could have been, what could be again, we'll talk basketball here briefly because it is Detroit related. The WNBA, they're looking to expand. I think they've got room for like one or two more expansion teams. Sheila Hamp and Jared Goff, both Lions, are trying, they're both involved, to try to bring a franchise back to Detroit. Now, the Detroit Shock existed here from 1998 to 2009. They were the champions in 03, 06, and 08. And, I was a fan from afar, but I was a fan. And I was a big fan when Bill Laimbeer was their coach. I was a big Bill Laimbeer fan, and I really thought the Pistons should have hired him around 2009 to be their head coach. And I'm always going to wonder what might have been had he launched into the Pistons. But the Shock, WNBA has been growing in popularity in the last couple of years. This could be pretty cool for Detroit if this were to happen.
Absolutely, 100% agree. I'm very much in favor of this move. I think it could be huge for the city. You've got guys. Obviously, you mentioned it. Jared Goff and Sheila Ford Hamp are in the mix, but then you've got like Pistons owner Tom Gores, who's also like in favor of this move, which I think is like super cool. It would be great for the city. I think Detroit is a great basketball town. You know, they're very sorely missing an NBA team. It's a good market. You could have them play at LCA. I think you could get some interest from a lot of just like the local community, fans, Pistons fans, that sort of thing. I remember, growing up when it was that like prime Pistons era of like your Chauncey Billups, your Ben Wallace, your Rip Hamilton, and like the Shock were right there with them, like doing well. Like that was such a fun time to be a basketball fan in Detroit, and I think desperately the city needs it. And so, like I said, very much in favor of this move, Matthew. I think it would be really cool. I've heard some issues about like the trademark of the name, the Shock, being available, whether it is, whether it's not. I don't know if it's going to be like sort of a carbon copy of that, but if they can get a WNBA team in some capacity, whatever that looks like, whatever the team name's going to be, whatever players end up being on the team, I just think it would be so cool. So definitely in favor of that one.
No, I mentioned it to my daughters that it was that that Detroit was putting a bid in on it, and that Sheila and Jared were both in on wanting to be part of that, among others. And I've got two daughters in elementary school, and they are thrilled. They let out a big out yell. They're like, "We're going to the game." I'm like, "Yeah, we will. If they get a franchise, we will go to their first home game." They're like, "No, we're going to their first game." And I'm like, "Well, it depends where that game's being played, because that's going to play a factor in it, but." We will do everything we can, if they get the franchise, to be at that very first home game. And I also told them I think it's a couple years away, even if you get this, because it's going to take a while for everything to come together. But
I don't think your daughters are alone in that. I definitely think there's a lot of other fans that share that kind of same excitement, myself included. I mean, I'd go check it out for sure, and definitely think that that's a little bit of a reason to be excited about basketball here in the Motor City.
Awesome. Well, Cameron, we are just about out of time here. Any final thoughts on the Detroit Lions? Anything we've talked about? Upcoming season? Any final thoughts you want to share?
I think it's going to be a key offseason for the Lions. They've got some decisions to make in terms of players. They've got some decisions to make on the draft side of things. And, like we've really documented here in this conversation, this season ended more abruptly than we would have liked. But I don't think by any means the window is closed for the Lions. I think they'll be back. I think they have some retooling to do and some things to fix over the offseason, but I'm very much excited for next season and beyond. I think the future's bright for the Lions. I really do.
Awesome. And Cameron, before you get out of here, remind the listeners, I mentioned some stuff at the beginning of the show, but where can they find your work? Where can they catch you if they want to learn more about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of mentioned it at the beginning. I do photography and videography all over Metro Detroit. You can check out my work at c2visualmedia.com. That's the letter C, number 2, visualmedia.com. I'm also on Instagram at c2visualmedia. And then you can follow me on Twitter at my there is at Cameron Clothier, which is my first and last name. So I'm pretty active. Like to share my work, like to talk Lions, always up for a good conversation about the Lions or Michigan Wolverines or Detroit sports. And, Matthew, I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to you today. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. And folks, thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. You can find more episodes and content at notthesameoldlions.com. You can check us out on social media at NTSOL Podcast on Twitter or X. You can find us on Instagram as well. Tell your friends and family about the show. Comment on socials. Please subscribe regardless of your listening platform. And until next time, stay gritty, my friends.